Thank you for being here this morning. If you don't have one of the lesson sheets, just hold up your hand. Some of these guys will bring it to you. We're glad that you're here, and we're just glad to see everyone on the Sunday morning that comes out for Bible study. We'll be talking about Judges chapter 4 and 5 in just a few minutes. A couple things before we get to that. The only ones I know of that are on our sick list, Sue Glenn, she's at home now, and we think Lauren Moore is home. We'll have to find out more about that. Next Sunday morning, we won't have class. We will be in our campaign for Christ. Starts next Sunday morning, 7th grade and up. We'll be here in the auditorium for the Sunday school, and then we'll have Jeff Jenkins will be our speaker that day. And the campaign starts Sunday night, so I hope you're making plans to be here Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Then Wednesday night of next week, there will be no classes. Jeff Jenkins will still be here to speak to us. So make plans to be part of the campaign for Christ next week, starting Sunday morning. We talk about something each Sunday. We want to talk about something that people here are doing. This week we want to talk about the group that we had that went down to Vidor, Texas. We had Lisa led a group down there with Jimmy Timms and James Hester and Shasta Frost from out at Snowdown went down there to help in the hurricane relief. James said they worked in 4 or 5 houses, and they were cleaning out sheetrock, getting it ready so that it could dry out. James told me that only 20% of the people down there had flood insurance because it had never flooded before. You think about your house, it's probably never flooded before. You don't need flood insurance. But all of a sudden, there was a lot of folks that needed flood insurance. We're proud of Lisa Hodgen for leading this group, taking this group down there, and making arrangements to go down there. You know, there will be people for the next 20 to 30 years. They may not know anything about the church at Boonville, Mississippi, but they will remember they saw a van come through when they needed help, and it said Boonville Church of Christ, Boonville, Mississippi. You know, we need to make a difference in the world, and these folks made a difference last week, a difference for people that really needed it. Today we're looking at Judges chapter 4 and 5, mostly in chapter 4. We want to talk about Deborah. And as you look at the characters that we'll be speaking about today, first of all, there's Jabin. He was the king of Hazor. He was a tyrant. He was a pagan king. Deborah, a Jewish judge. She was a woman of faith and courage. Then we have Barak, a reluctant general. He was the leader of the Jewish army. Sisera is the captain of Jabin's army. And actually, Sisera was the main force behind the forces of evil in this story today. Heber, he was a Kenite. He was a neighbor of theirs. He was at peace with Jabin. He was trying to live on that fence between the Jews and the pagans. Jael, the wife of Heber, and here's a woman that was handy with a hammer. And then we have Jehovah God. God is in charge of war. He's in charge of weather. And you'll see that God has a lot to do with what happens here. God is in control of the events that are going to happen in Deborah chapter 4. And He controlled the events that happen. So let's look at what happens here in in the book of Deborah happens in the fourth chapter of the book of Judges, as we see what Deborah is going to do. The first part, chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. It says, when Ehud was dead, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who dwelt in Harosheth. And the children of Israel cried out to the Lord, for Jabin had 900 chariots of iron, and for 20 years he had harassed and oppressed the children of Israel. You know, the key person in this first part is Jabin. It says that he was the king of Hazor. When you read here, it says that Ehud had brought peace to the land for 80 years. Ehud had done that. And you would think that after the death of Ehud that they would remember what he had done. But they didn't. Just as soon as he passed away and the constraints were taken away, the children of Israel went back to the same thing that they had always done. They had returned to worshiping those pagan gods that Ehud had removed them. You know, they wanted to obey their own desires. And they wanted to go back to doing something that they wanted to do. And God chose a person to discipline them. He chose Jabin. The name here is the official title for the king of Hazor. He's also called the king of Canaan. See, he was the head of a confederation of several city-states. And they had gotten together. And they had an army that consisted of 900 chariots of iron. Children of Israel didn't have a standing army. They didn't even have anything that you would consider to be military implements to fight with. They felt like that they were being subdued by a pagan group. And Jabin was the head of that group. Notice that it says here in the text that the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. They cried out because they were being oppressed, because they didn't know what to do. And they knew that they needed to cry out to God. Do you see anything in the text that says that they were wanting to repent? I don't. All I see is that they cried out because they were being oppressed. They cried out to God because they wanted deliverance. But God was going to deliver them again. Let's look at part 2 of this story. Verses 4 through 7. Now Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Labatha, was judging in Israel at the time. And she would sit under the palm tree of Deborah between Ramoth and Bethel in the mountains of Ephraim. And the children of Israel came out to her for judgment. Then she sent and called for Barak in Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, has not the Lord of Israel commanded, go and deploy troops at Mount Tabor? Take with you 10,000 men of the sons of Naphtali and the sons of Zebulun. And again I say, and again you will, and again I will deploy, and against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with the chariots and his multitude at the river Kishon, and I will deliver you into his hand. Notice here that God called a woman named Deborah. And he calls her not only a judge, but he called her a prophetess. God was using a woman in a male-dominated society to deliver his people. And there's a message there for God's people. They were acting like children. God sent a mother of Israel to deliver them because they were acting like children. It says that she was both a prophetess and a judge. You know, there are other ladies in the Bible that are called prophetess. Moses' sister Miriam is called a prophetess. Later in the Old Testament, there's a lady named Huldah in 2 Kings 2 that's called a prophetess. Anna is called a prophetess in the book of Luke. The daughters of Philip are called prophetess in Acts chapter 21. But more importantly than being a prophetess, she was a mother to Israel. In chapter 5, when you read the Song of Deborah, she calls herself a mother in Israel because she had been sent by God to deliver these people. But notice the message that she had. She had a message that God had revealed to her. And she said, I want you to call Barak. Now, if you have your map, you'll see that Deborah was in the middle of the country. And she was calling Barak from Naphtali, which is in the northern part of their territory. And she was calling him to come down because she had a message for him. And that message was that I want you to go back and I want you to assemble an army of 10,000 men. And you assemble those troops from two different tribes, from Ephraim and Naphtali, or I think it was. And I want you to bring those together at Mount Tabor. If you look on the map, Mount Tabor is at the intersection of Issachar, Zebulun, and Naphtali. You bring those 10,000 troops together there. I have a plan. You bring them there, and I'll take care of the rest of it, is what God was telling Deborah. You bring them to the edge of the Kishon River, and God would take care of the rest. God wanted to glorify himself through his people. And he was telling them to bring his people there. I want you to notice that God chose the leader. God chose the place that the battle was going to take place. God had the plan. All the people of Israel had to do was follow God's plan. That's all they had to do. Just like in the old days with Joshua. You do what God tells you to do, and everything's going to turn out all right. Everything is going to be good. Let's look at the third part of this plan. Beginning in verse 8 through 10. And you'll see a reluctant leader here. It says, And Barak said to her, If you will go with me, then I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Barak said, I'll go if you go. I want you to be with me. You're the one that's received the plan. You go with me. Notice that God didn't object to it. And Deborah went. So she said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking. For the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of the woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh and went up with 10,000 men under his command. And Deborah went up with them. Why do you suppose that Barak wanted Deborah to go with him? Was he not confident enough in God's plan? You know, it doesn't tell us why, but we know for some reason he wanted God's prophetess, God's judge, to go with him. Could have been that she would probably do better with raising an army than he would do, but we don't know. But we know that it was part of God's plan for her to go. Barak was reluctant. You know, he was kind of like Moses when God called him at the burning bush. I'm not real sure about this plan, God, but I'll go and do it because you said to do it. He was kind of like those that came after him, Gideon and Jeremiah. He was wondering, is this plan really going to work? We don't have a standing army. We don't have the implements of war to fight against. You know, God doesn't need a multitude of people to do great things. He only needs one or two people who are willing to do what He tells them to do and follow His word completely. And God used these 10,000 as a seed, as the beginning of a great rebellion against a group of people that have been abusing them for about 20 years. But God used them. What can God do with us? You know, we figure we're only a small group of people. But what can God do with just a small group of people? As we see, God can do great things. God can do amazing things. This was an act of faith for Barak and Deborah to step out in faith because they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know if they would be successful or not. But Deborah knew that God was telling her what she needed to do. And then we have the fourth part, a victorious confrontation. Let's look at beginning in verse 11. Now Heber the Kenite of the children of Joab, the father-in-law of Moses. Notice that there is a connection back to the children of Israel through Moses here. He had separated himself from the Kenites and pitched his tent, besides Kadesh. And they reported to Sisera, the son of Abjanan, having gone up to Mount Tabor. Here we see the Kenites. They're normally associated with the tribe of Judah. But Heber had separated himself. And he was in the middle of this. He was in Kadesh, in Naphtali. and he was there and saw what was happening. He saw that the Jews had raised an army of 10,000 people. They were down at Mount Tabor. And he was at peace with Jabin. And he reported it to Jabin. You know, this was all part of God's plan. He was reporting what he saw. He was telling Jabin and his army where the children of Israel were assembling, that there was a rebellion coming, and where to go to. This was all part of the plan that God had, because he wanted to draw the 900 chariots of iron out into the open. It's generally assumed that Sisera would not move his army, would not move these 900 chariots at the wrong time of the year. It had to be the dry season. Evidently, it was the dry season, because he moved those 900 chariots, and he moved them toward Mount Tabor, because he had received reports that the Jews were there, and he wanted to go and to defeat them. Sisera had been warned. He knew where they were, and he wanted to go there and to annihilate the rebellion that was being planned at Mount Tabor. It was all part of God's plan that Heber would be there. You know, Jabin had no reason not to believe the report that he had received, because he was at peace with the Kenites. He wasn't at war with them. They didn't stand to gain anything. But he believed it, and he moved his army. Then we see that Sisera is defeated. Verse 13. So Sisera gathered together all of his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the people who were with him, to the river Kishon. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Up, for this day is which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone out before you?" And Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him, and the Lord routed Sisera and all of his chariots and all of his army with the edge of the sword before Barak and Sisera alighted from his chariot and fled on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and the army, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. What happened? You know, to get more details, you have to go over to chapter 5. And if you go over to chapter 5, you'll see that God sent a rainstorm. He sent a flood. They were in the Jezreel Valley at Megiddo. And what happens when you have chariots and you have a flood? It gets muddy. They were bogged down. Their 900 chariots of iron, instead of being an asset, became a liability. They were bogged down. They couldn't move. And the children of Israel were able to destroy an army that they considered so much more stronger than they were. Another interesting thing in verse 15 of the reading that we just had, says that he routed the army. The original meaning means that he caused confusion, caused them to run in every direction, God caused confusion in the eyes of the army of Sisera. He bogged them down, and he caused confusion. You know, if Sisera was thinking about, as he would be thinking about this, he would be wondering, because his God was the God of storms. And here they were in the dry season, and all of a sudden, it was raining. He was bogged down in the mud. He couldn't move. What had happened to the pagan gods? Were they not as strong as the God of the Jews? Had their God forsaken them? They were confused. They didn't know how to react, because they were being defeated. They were losing the battle. But who had caused it? Jehovah God had caused a rainstorm in the dry season and caused their army to be completely destroyed. They were trapped. And then they see that Sisera is slain. Beginning in verse 17. However, Sisera fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. For there was peace between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. And Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord. Turn aside to me. Do not fear." And when he had turned aside with her into the tent, she covered him with a blanket. And then he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I'm thirsty." And she opened a jug of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And he said to her, "Stand at the door of the tent, and if any man comes and inquires of you and says, 'Is there any man here?' you shall say no." Jael, Heber's wife, took a tent peg, took a hammer in her hand, and went softly to him, and drove the peg through his temple. And it went down into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary. And so he died. And then as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him and said to him, "Come, I will show you the man whom you seek." And when he went into her into her tent, there was Sisera dead with a peg through his temple. And on that day God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, in the presence of the children of Israel. Sisera had left the battlefield. He was fleeing on foot. He knew that he had been defeated. When he came to the tents of Heber, he felt like that he had come to a place where he could take refuge, because they didn't have any problems with the Kenites. They weren't at war with them. He felt like this was friendly ground, and he let down his guard. You know, weariness had gotten the best of him. And you know, he was tired. In those days, it would have been unheard of to enter the tent of a woman if you were not her husband. But Sisera went in to seek refuge at the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber. He knew that nobody would go into that tent. That would have been against custom. That he was safe there, and he felt safe. And notice that Jael offered him  offered him a place to lay down to rest. When he asked for water, she gave him milk. She covered him and made sure that he was comfortable. But you know, Sisera made a mistake when he asked her. Say, if any man comes seeking me, you tell him I'm not here. You lie for me. You cover for me. You know, Jael was a woman that had a lot of wisdom. She knew that if Sisera was running, it was because his army had been defeated. And she knew that if she didn't do something, that her distant relatives, the Jews, would be upset with her because she had given refuge for the one person that the army was seeking, for the captain of the army. She knew she had to do something. Jael showed great courage because after Sisera had laid down and gone to sleep, she walked in and took a tent peg and drove it through his temple, killing the commander of the army of the enemies of God. You know, Deborah had made a promise. She had told Barak that you'll not get the glory for capturing the captain of the army, that would go to a woman. And here we see Jael, the wife of Heber, a Kenite, taking the life of the captain of the army of Jabin. God's promises were fulfilled. God allowed a woman to take the life of the captain. You know, for a captain to flee from a battle, it would have been embarrassing. For him to be killed while fleeing would be humiliating. But to be killed by a woman was the most disgraceful thing that the captain of an army could ever imagine. And yet it happened here, just as Deborah had promised, that a woman was going to take his life. Over in chapter 5, verse 24, it says, "Blessed above all women shall Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, be. Blessed shall she be above the women in the tent." She was recognized for all of the courage that it took for her to do what she did and to kill this captain of the army of Jabin. But it was still all part of God's plan. God had made the plan, and God carried out the plan using the people that He wanted to be used. Notice the last verse in chapter 4. "And the hand of the children of Israel grew stronger and stronger against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan." God allowed them to become stronger and stronger because of the faith and the courage of Deborah. Chapter 5 is a song. You know, sometimes we don't remember all of the facts of history, but yet here is a song of a glorious celebration where they are celebrating the great things that God had done for the children of Israel. The first 12 verses is a praise to God, because it was all done because God allowed it to be done. That God gave them the plan. He gave them the strength. He took care of them. And he did everything that he had promised that he would do for them. God delivered his people. In the darkest of days, he delivered his people. Verses 13 through 18, it talks about the praise for those that had been willing to stand up for all of the tribes. And about 6 of the 12 tribes had come out to help in this effort. You know, in the times of Joshua, all of the tribes worked together. But in the book of Judges, they don't all work together. But only about half of the tribes had come and helped them in this great deliverance. And it's pointed out there. And in verses 24 through 30, it talks about the courage of a woman, of Jael, because she was willing to step up and to do what was necessary. You know, all of this is all a good story. It tells a story of events that happened. But if we only take it for just that, just a story, we miss the whole meaning of the story of Deborah. Look at verse 31 of chapter 5. Thus let all of your enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the sun when it comes out in full strength. The story of Barak and Deborah is a story of fighting, of light and darkness. The forces of light, God's people, were on one side. And the forces of darkness, represented here in this story by Sisera and Barak, Sisera and Jabin, is a story of the forces of darkness, and they meet. They meet at a place called Megiddo, on the banks of the Kishon River. And the forces of light are the ones that are victorious. Move forward 1,000 years or so, close to the end of the very first century. We have John the Apostle, the last of the living apostles, writing the letter of Revelation. And as he's coming to pouring out the bowls of wrath upon the Roman Empire, during the pouring out of the 6th bowl of wrath, he talks about a great battle of light and darkness. And at that time, he calls it the Battle of Armageddon, where God's forces of good are going to face the forces of evil at a place called Armageddon. He was referring back to this battle. He was referring to the actual battle of Deborah and Barak against Jabin's army. It was a real battle. But the Apostle John was talking about a battle that was coming, where God's forces would face the Roman Empire, a literal battle. And he referred to the Battle of Armageddon, where God's people would be victorious over the forces of evil. You know, God's people will always be victorious over the forces of evil if we are God's people. The people in John's day that were facing persecution from the Roman Empire could look back through history and see that God had always taken care of his people. But what does that mean to us today in Booneville, Mississippi in 2017? It means that regardless of what happens in the future, that God will always take care of His people. The question that we need to answer today for ourselves is, are we God's people? And are we following after what God is telling us what to do? And as long as we are, God will take care of us. That no force on this earth can defeat us if we are God's people. Our time is up. Next week we will have we'll be engaged in the campaign for Christ, so we won't have class next week. Thank you.